My goal today is to literally capsize your thinking of the history of America, the history of Newport, and most importantly, the history of African heritage people. In this story today that you'll hear is a story of one of the earliest and largest African burying grounds right here in Newport. Before the American Revolution, Newport, Rhode Island was the largest and most active slave port in all of British North America. Not Boston, not Charleston, South Carolina, not New York, but Newport. As early as 1708, enslaved Africans outnumbered indentured white servants in this community by 8-1. And in the years leading up to the American Revolution, by 1770, 1 out of every 4 Newport households owned at least one enslaved African. At that time, Newport had the highest percentage of enslaved and some free Africans in all the American colonies outside of Charleston, South Carolina. But before I begin to tell the story of these Africans and their evolution from enslavement to freedom, it's important to understand and recognize the history of Newport, the very settlement of Newport, because Newport, specifically, and generally Rhode Island, was settled under the tenets of religious toleration and freedom. The early English settlers, the nonconformists that arrived here and settled by 1639, were not explorers or conquerors. They weren't searching and seeking gold and land for kings and queens. They were highly persecuted men, women, and families of religious minorities of both the old world and the new world who were simply looking for a place to worship God freely. And those men and women and families that settled here would establish by 1663 a body of laws or a charter that for the first time in world history, any citizen had the right to worship God freely without the oversight of a king or a queen or a royal governor. That is why today we are the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, but most importantly, we are the first place where people were able to come and live freely and worship freely. Now, the irony is that as those men, women, and families would establish themselves, some of the earliest Quaker communities is not Philadelphia, but it's here in Newport, along our Point neighborhood, or Easton's Point neighborhood. By 1658, Jews arrive, and today we have one of the earliest and most extensive collection of Jewish places of worship and households in early America. The Baptist faith established by Roger Williams in Providence, but the first Baptist church structures are built here in Newport. This was a place where men, women, and families had achieved religious toleration. But ironically, and almost simultaneously, as they established themselves in the merchant trade, we are a city by the sea, they are involving themselves in the enslavement of fellow human beings. So on one hand, they're practicing and benefiting from religious freedom and toleration, and on the other hand, they're practicing and benefiting from the enslavement of fellow human beings. But it's important to recognize that as Newport was established at that time, and as slaves were entering into this community, how they lived together, how they worked together, how they worshiped together, and eventually how they died is much different than what we commonly know and understand of the history of slavery in the early history of America. For the most part, when we think of the history of slavery, we tend to think of commercially viable movies and books like Roots. We tend to think of the antebellum period or the American South of the West Indies. We think of cotton fields, rice plantations, tobacco fields, sugar plantations. We think of a Charleston, South Carolina, or a Savannah, Georgia, or a Bridgetown, Barbados, or a Nassau, Bahamas, but we don't think about Rhode Island. We certainly don't think about Newport, but it's important to recognize that there were 3 very unique conditions at that time that would change the course of those Africans and enable them to advance themselves into freedom and prosperity earlier than other Africans that were enslaved, unfortunately, in the American South or the West Indies or South America. The first condition, it's our weather. This is New England. It's not the Bahamas. It's not the Carolinas. Weather is inclement. And along with inclement weather, the soil is less than desirable. So those cash crops that demanded large slave labor force on sugar plantations in the Bahamas or Jamaica wouldn't exist here. We had instead an environment that was more conducive to urban seaport living. So most of these Africans that arrived were not working on sugar plantations or tobacco fields or cotton fields. They were literally working side by side in many cases and trained for all the different merchant class jobs and trades that were required at that time. We also find that many of the Africans that arrived here were an English colony. We're not Spanish or Portuguese or Dutch or French, we're an English colony. So we're trading with other English settlements and colonies. In the 17th into the 18th century, the English slave forts along the West African coast were along what is today Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and Guinea. So nearly all the enslaved Africans that would arrive here arrived from those locations, and many times via English colonies in the West Indies. So that triangular trade, as it's popularly called, was at the very center of the Newport economy. And just to give you a sense of what that looked like, how that felt, before the American Revolution, Newport was involved in the largest activities of the rum trade. And that's taking rum products and then using them to trade for more slaves in the West African coast, and then bringing those slaves to the West Indies. And there, those slaves would become the labor force on sugar plantations that would produce the sugar and molasses that would be shipped back up to Newport, and Newport would distill it into rum. Before the American Revolution, Newport had over 24 rum distilleries along our waterfront. When we talk about noise and drinking today, you should have been in Newport in 1770. And those 24 rum distilleries produced nearly 80% of the Guinea rum in the world market. Some of the wealthiest and earliest families and family systems in the Americas began through this trade and began within Newport. But as these Africans would arrive, they arrived not to work in sugar plantations or tobacco fields. They were to provide all of the basic necessities and all of the basic trade skills that was required in an economy at that time. In fact, Africans were involved in almost every aspect of the very building and operating of the Newport economy. By about 1774, right at the eve of the American Revolution, Africans represent about a third of the entire population. We have about 12,000 citizens here. New York is about 15, Philadelphia at 20, to give you a perspective. But out of those 12,000 citizens, over 3,000 are enslaved and a few free Africans. And again, not like me, African American, but men, women, and children that originated in West Africa, in the Yoruba people of Nigeria, or the Ashanti people of Ghana. And as these Africans would arrive and be involved in trade, they would literally build everything that was of Newport economy at that time. They're not beasts of the fields. They're not large labor force. They are carpenters, stonemasons, snuff making, chocolate grinding, glass blowing, painting, ship riggers, cord winding, women working in seamstress and large sail lofts. So these Africans, because of the requirements of skilled trades, had access to education and training that would have been unheard of in the American South or the West Indies. Not because slave masters and mistresses were any kinder or gentler here. They were pragmatic and they were responding to the economy that existed in colonial New England generally, and particularly in Newport. So today, many of the most historic buildings that we have in this community were built not by slave labor, but by skilled labor of African men, women, and children. Our brick marketplace, completed in 1762. The Redwood Library, the oldest lending library in America, in 1747. Turrell's Synagogue, the oldest existing Jewish place of worship, in 1763. And our old Colony House right here on Washington Square, one of the 4 earliest state capitol buildings, were all constructed not by slave labor, but by skilled and trained, enslaved, and some free Africans. In fact, what I have to remind people, if it wasn't for the skills and the training of those Africans, these architectural masterpieces that we completely wow today would not exist. It's also important to recognize that when these Africans arrived, they were young. In fact, most of the Africans that arrived here via the West Indies were under the age of 13. In some cases, African children, 7, 8, 9 years old, would arrive in Newport. Now, I can even begin to think of a 6 to 8 month passage from West Africa to the West Indies and eventually to Newport, what that would be for any human being. We know as scholars that about 12.5 million Africans made it through the passage. But here in Newport, we don't need strong men and strong women to work on large plantations. We need children who are going to spend the next 4 years of their life training and apprenticeship so that they can become that next craft person. So these African children, when they arrived, they're not living in slave quarters or separate and apart. This is not Georgia, 1860. This is Newport in 1760. African children are living in the same household as master and mistress. As they get older, they live in the garret or the attic, or there's sometimes we see them in the pantry. But most importantly, Africans are living together, working together, and then most importantly, we go back to the very founding by those nonconformist English settlers who care deeply about their religious freedom and toleration. Africans are now worshiping and taking on the religious identity of the master and mistress. And again, in context of what we generally know about enslavement in the Americas, if this was a plantation in Savannah, Georgia, or a plantation in Bridgetown, Barbados, it would have been unheard of, unnecessary, and unlawful to provide Africans access to education, religion, and certainly not cohabitation. But here, it's more practical because of the environment we're in. And what these Africans would do is they would take advantage of this opportunity of access to education and training, cohabitation, and they would begin to build and reclaim their own identity as Africans in America. Not African American like me. They didn't look like me, they didn't speak like me, thank goodness. They were African. And in 1780, for the first time in the history of African enslavement in the Western Hemisphere, a group of African men came together in Newport. Today it's called Memorial Boulevard, at the time Levin Street, the home of Abraham Casey, who was a master chocolate grinder, and they formed the Free African Union. We know this because the minutes of the Union between 1787 to 1810 still exist here at our Newport Historical Society. And this African Union Society sets up 3 very important programs. One, it wants to ensure that every African in Newport would have access to financial support in times of need. Secondly, they wanted to create a network of African unions with free Africans all over colonial America. And they would reach out and correspond with free Africans in Philadelphia, New York, Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston. And again, those letters and those correspondence still exist. And they're talking about, now that we're free, do we remain? Do we return to Africa? And it's a fascinating discussion between the Africans. In Boston, they're led by Prince Hall, who wants to establish and goes on to establish the Prince Hall Masonic Order. In Philadelphia, the Africans feel it's religion, and they establish the first Free African Methodist Episcopal and Free African Episcopal churches. Here in Newport, they're less interested in Masonic and they're less interested in churches because they have access to those things. They're really focused on building an African identity. And several years later, they established one of the earliest free African schools in America here in Newport on School Street. And it's a free African school, meaning no white oversight, no white funding, no white rules and regulations. The African men and women operate their school, teach their school, educate their children. And then the last most important point that these Africans would involve themselves in this African Union Society is that they would establish a burying ground. They were quite concerned with the fact that being in this seaport community, lots of ships coming in and out, lots of diseases unfortunately coming with ships. So death, unfortunately, was a very, very active, a very close part of living. So these Africans raised money to ensure that every African who would die in Newport would have a place to be buried. Today, in our common burying ground along appropriately Farewell Street, we have one of the largest common burying grounds in America, but on over an acre and a half in the northwest corner, as early as 1705, we have initially enslaved and then later free Africans. We have the largest concentration of enslaved and free African burials. Their existing stones as they originally were set and carved and marked, not in the American South, not in the West Indies, not Boston, not New York, but here in Newport. By the mid part of the 19th century, the African American community would lovingly call it God's little acre. And God's little acre today is recognized not only for its importance of having so many early markers, but is now being finally recognized to the fact that it also includes markers with etchings that begin to tell the story of where Africans originated from, their lives, and their eventual deaths. They're telling a story in stone that's not about chattel property. It's not about slaves and beasts of the fields. It's men, women, and children who persevered, who survived, and left the legacy of this burying ground for all of us here in Newport. As a young boy, my grandmother would say repeatedly, slavery is how we got here, but it tells you little to who we are as the people. The stories of stone that I'm presenting you today is not the stories of chattel property, it's the stories of the people. My grandmother, your grandmother, they're always right. They're the best historians. And as I said before, many of the children that would arrive here were quite young, under the age of 13. Many of the people who are buried with markers at the burying ground are also children, many of them dying at very young ages because of disease and pestilence. Many times they're stillborn, many times mothers dying with children. And what I wanted to end today in telling you this story, these stories in stone, was to give you a quick introduction to this very important burying ground and the men and women and families who are there, but through the eyes of the children. And what I'm going to try to present to you today is images of markers as they exist, and the etchings of those markers, so you'll get a sense of who is there in their short lives. But I'm also going to connect it with real images of children from Ghana, Nigeria, Guinea, and Senegal today. Because I want you to step back after seeing this and not think about slaves or chattel property or even ghosts of the historical past. I want you to think about flesh and blood human beings, beloved children who once graced these shores and lived, worked, worshiped, and eventually died in this historic city we call Newport. And as aptly stated in a proverb from Ghana, it's the human being that counts. I call gold, it does not answer. I call cloth, it does not answer. It's the human being that counts. So the next time you come to visit our beautiful community and enjoy the shopping and dining and beaching and tennis and sailing, also take time to visit our burying ground and remember the African men, women, and children who also contributed to building this great community and their stories in stone. Thank you.